One more. Thank you. Thanks for joining us at this time of the day. So it's after lunchtime is usually not the most preferred slot, but I like it. So less critical thinking, less challenge for me, I guess. No. So today there's two things. Again, I got this opening because of the unavailability of one pair of students that wanted to talk about their particular topic. So, but turns out it's actually quite a good slot for us to occupy. First of all, we can make up in terms of the presented material that we had to present. So because we always have something up our sleeve that we still want to get across and never managed to do. But in this particular context, it's also helpful to fill the gaps a bit in terms of what the presentations of the different topics should be about. And to start off with, on a lighter note, I first want to talk about some examples of awareness games that I think worthwhile noticing, and of course bring it back then to the theme of serious games, hopefully, or you can tell me if I do in the end. And then see if we have time afterwards. I just want to go briefly into different player types that we find in serious games or in games more generally. But that depends on our progress and the nature of the discussion. So I think the weight of this lecture should clearly be on this part here. The latter part is not that centrally relevant, especially since it is not strongly academically supported. One of the reasons why I'm doing this is also to give you an impression how I would see those introductory parts of the student lectures to kind of flow to some extent, but also to clarify that there can be on a very light note as well at times. Anyway, so I just want to go through a set of examples and perhaps bring in some outside perspective as well, what different game-based learning forms can be construed as serious games as well. We'll talk about this and we make it part of the discussion afterwards. But first of all, what's awareness about? The group last week gave a good introduction already in highlighting what the central issues is, but bring it down to something very basic. Well, guess what? We need to raise awareness of issues that withdraw themselves from our perspective. That's often the time. Oftentimes, if we face the situation that there either is some sort of global decision making, right? So that is done by actors we don't have any insight into. We can't retrace why this decision is actually done. Like a few years ago, there was the idea of having a Northern American European free trade agreement, and most people on the ground were actually against it, right? But nevertheless, was pushed forward. It didn't succeed in the end. But the question is what is happening in their head, or what is the information that we don't have that makes it challenging for us to retrace what the actual decision making is. And this is kind of the kind of games that the awareness, that's the kind of issues where awareness games can be quite helpful to actually show macro level phenomena that are not self-evident. They don't understand just by looking at it, by reading about it, but you kind of need to experience it in a way to get an appreciation and why people take decisions they take. So for example, putting yourself into a position of a decision maker, right? So has to decide over fate of human lives potentially, puts you in a very different spot suddenly, and perhaps leverages a different understanding of the situation. The other example is the complexity of cause-effect relationship. We don't oversee all the complexity that a social system surrounds. So we just are limited in our scope of perception, and sometimes it's quite good to get out of this. In addition to perspective making, so having a tool such as a game that allows us to see those complex cause-effects relationships more explicitly can be quite helpful. So as you can see, this is a rather abstract conception of awareness in the widest sense, and it allows for a lot of different games. It could, for example, allow for engineering simulation games as far as I'm concerned, because they could be for awareness as well, right? But what you most often find is that awareness games in serious games context, unlike education and training, are usually tagged as games for good. So you don't have the particular purpose of giving you opportunity to get away with, entrenched knowledge in mathematics or geometric understanding or knowing how civil engineering actually works from the ground up, but rather to make you sensitive for an issue at hand that may be currently relevant, oftentimes, or is of relevant in general. And I'll show you an example of that nature in a bit. Most often those kind of games are not financed by, or they are rarely underlie a business model. We have two exceptions in the selection that I'll provide you. But most of the times they're either financed by international agencies such as World Health Organization, FAO, USDA, or of course also the Research Council of Norway, for example, European Commission, to stay closer to home here, and of course NGOs as well that have certain missions of raising awareness about food issues and so on. So with this, kind of leave you with an understanding of what I see as awareness in this particular context. So not awareness about everything, but rather about the larger social phenomena that are relevant. Found this nice figure, so felt I had to put it in. Basically just says in one figure again what serious games are, what they are not. Quite neat. If anyone wants to adopt it for their report here, you find it under this overview. This is, by the way, from the book that I linked about serious games from 2016. How many people looked at this book? Good. You probably do that for your report because there's really good stuff in there in all your different areas, amongst other this figure. And it actually highlights neatly many of the discussion, many of the areas that we are actually concerned with in terms of the application area. And one of them, important one that the authors identified, is particularly social awareness perspective. But if you want to see further examples for either of those, this book is actually quite a good hint there. But also shows nicely how different areas are interlinked, at least how they see the influence factors of different areas play into realizing a game experience for those different application areas. Anyway, with this aside, who's that? Or what is that, rather? Anyone? No, wait. Anyone wants to speak up? No? Anyone watch news in our call? What is that? Please.
The furry that get infected.
That's right. What happened there? Any feeling? Crowdsourcing. Let's bring it together.
The one that grew from China to Japan.
Exactly, right? So it sits in Yokohama, was it? I don't know, right? It's tied down there for 2 weeks because they had an infection of a few hundred people there. I think it's 3,500 people on this boat. And now they're basically just waiting for 2 weeks in a quarantine and just wait silently how the infection spreads, right? Because that's exactly what's happening there right now. And they'll probably have another week and they'll probably be released from their misery to some extent. But it points to a very relevant current issue, of course, right? We all know about it, but we don't need to go into this one. But this was not the first time in history that we had this issue, right? So it happens that, and there's frequent references made to it, that around, what is it? 15 years ago, I don't know, how many years ago? We had SARS as the last, 2003, I believe, right, wasn't it? One of the big epidemics as well, and so on. And it happened so that the question was there: how can we sensitize people for the level of for the issues that are at hand, of course, on an individual level, but more importantly, how do the big decision makers, like international intergovernmental agency and so on, actually deal with this? What are the kind of decisions they underlie? We're always looking at the news, next day we find, oh, World Health Organization declares the following. What does it actually mean, right? I mean, okay, sure, I declare something every day, but it doesn't mean anything. So, but why does it mean something? And to develop a bit of a sensitivity in this area, there was actually a game developed under the auspices, not listed here, of a Dutch biologist. It was a larger project embedded in I think a European project. I don't recall right now by heart. But the idea is there that you just play the epidemic and model some interventions, right? So the idea is there that you have certain actions at hand, research teams at hand, and so on. And the idea is that you need to manage those accordingly. And the interesting bit is that I find it in any case is that it brings about some moral dilemmas. And without really intending to play that at this stage, of course, I'll just show you an example, or just show you that game. Again, this game is from 2009. It comes with the necessary pain of being a flash game. One could consider this viral in itself in the meantime. In any case, I don't have sound, I believe, because we don't have sound. It's a bit sad because it has a really catchy sound attached to it. So
well, we did get sound through with the Kahoot game. I think you have to connect some the HDMI. I think it
HDMI doesn't work, so I need to use this old-fashioned way. See how that goes. It doesn't go well. No, it doesn't. All right. Doesn't matter really. It's not that we're not playing it. I think. You see, perhaps we do. But fundamentally, that's the game was about. So you can choose between 5 different pests. Yeah, you choose. Oh, you have the choice. Great. Start from very easy to very complex, and then basically, that's difficult is easy. Let's take something that's a bit more. Oh yeah, that looks reasonably ugly. Cool. And basically, the idea is that you play this game. It takes a while to set up, and you have the kind of world map there. Basically, you can model there, or you can see the world map eventually, and you have a set of interventions you can apply to mitigate it. This game has found considerable attention, both in the media because it was developed under the support of a known virologist, meaning had some sort of scientific evidence behind it in terms of epidemiology, so like the spread of the virus really. Not really, of course, the specifics, but the idea is there basically that you then can pick countries of choice, rather continents of choice. We pick Eastern Europe and providing with them advanced surveillance systems. By the way, on the top right, you see there's a warning. What's the warning about? Right, there's a warning about a future outbreak, whatever that may be. And how to close this down here. And now your task is, you don't know anything right now, but you can start, for example, storing vaccinations in given countries, deploying additional doctors. Let's take Russia for this purpose. And let's not forget Norway, we need face masks here. So, right, and you can navigate around, and you basically see a world population of, that's the continent population of Western Europe of 5 million. So it's not too off 10 years ago and so on. What happens over time is that the news spread and so on, and eventually the virus breaks out. And right now I only cared about the northern European hemisphere, so I probably should improve research facilities in India, that's a good idea, and stockpile some medicine in China as well. So, and again, it's northern hemisphere, again, strong bias there. And then eventually, the game takes on, and eventually the epidemic spreads from somewhere. And you can then see how successful your interventions were. You can apply in real time. You have emergency research teams you can deploy at your disposal here. Just send someone. We had India already. Let's put it in the Middle East. Cool. And see how it goes. Anyway, so that's just the feel of that game. So you can play it through. It was played by 100,000 of people. Was quite successful in its own right. I'm not sure if it's still supported. I mean, it's still there in any case. But of course, so you can just play it through, basically is the idea. Has considerable news coverage, and you see the moral dilemmas embedded in there already, because you need to deploy who gets what, right? You can't put everything everywhere. So, and that's precisely kind of dilemmas the World Health Organization deals with. They have limited resources. Resources are regionally distributed. So here we assume resources are globally available. That's not realistic. You need to redistribute them, right? So we know this from the current crisis that we have a lot of shortcomings in certain areas, and that's a reasonably accurate reflection. So if you want to learn more about particular diseases, or spread epidemiology, that's quite worthwhile. So here's the next news. A.B. Osterhaus, that's the guy who kind of was fundamentally involved in the development. Strange disease in China and Japan, so most likely if we go there right now, we'll probably find some initial. So we are betting on the right. So I didn't see any spread yet. Usually you see it in a visual representation and so on. We'll see. It will come perhaps later. Anyway, I'm not getting stuck on that game right now. We just leave it running in the background and see what happens.
So it's a game and not just a simulation, or?
It's a game. It's the idea of simulation. The difference would be basically there that you have real-time intervention. Right? And the objective is to minimize the number of deaths, right? So here's, for example, in the end would look like this. You have the number of infected and the number of people who have died. You want to, of course, minimize this, right, as part of your scoreboard and so on. But you see, it's a very, very
it's a scoreboard, and there are scoreboards and leaderboards.
That's right. That's right. So that's why it's a social entity, activity. But you can't play it in teams. It's a flash game. It's inherently single player. It's considered a serious game in itself because it has clear objectives and clear mechanics, and is informed by actual research. That's how it's done. That's the practical problems they're facing. So you're playing basically WHO there. So that's one of the games. That's quite worthwhile. Perhaps you want, you can play the game. I'll of course have it linked in the slides. Moving on from there, there's another worthwhile set of games actually. It was called Global Conflict Series. Unfortunately, many of the games that I'm talking about, they're kind of a bit dated in the sense that I'm not quite sure if they're actually actively developed anymore, or respectively supported. That's sometimes the pity that you'll find in the areas. But we talk about it. I mean, we had the Oregon Trail game, which was really old and certainly not supported anymore. But we have a similar situation here. So this is another kind of setting. And the idea is here, it's called the Global Conflict Series. And the idea was there, that was funded, I should have written this here, this was funded actually by governmental agencies specifically from Scandinavia. So Denmark, Sweden, Norway were involved, I think Finland as well. And the idea was as follows. You create a one-to-one situation with an avatar, with an actor, that sensitizes you to specific regional issues, right? Classical things like, Middle East or something like this, right? So we have an example, Palestine, of course, Bangladeshi sweatshop, or corruption. Because people don't have a real, well, I would say the average Nordic student doesn't really have exposure to any three of those, right? So at least not in a real life setting. But of course in any schooling setting, that's not specific, it's just the fact that it was funded from Norway, amongst others. To have one-on-one interaction with an avatar and to observe students changing argumentation over time. And the mechanics was as follows, that you collect information, evidence, by walking around this space and interacting. And then you have a boss fight in the end. What's a boss fight, gamers? Everyone knows what a boss fight is? Sure.
The final challenge-ish.
That's right, exactly. I just want to just put it out there in terms of I'm using jargon, I don't know. But those digital natives, they don't need any catch up on that one. So anyway, the boss fight. The boss fight is basically not so much a fight, but it's based on argumentation. You kind of need to win or win against the other side. For example, a drug boss, or a owner of a Bangladeshi sweatshop, or some Palestinian terrorist, or whatever else. And you need to make your argumentation cleverly, and then win the game on that basis, right? Fighting with words. Okay, it's a long stretch, right? So, but point is, it was made for an educational setting. The idea is that you gather information, you learn, you see the alignment element there, that you subtly, absorb more information than you actually have. And that was basically the main purpose. I'll just show you some glimpses of those respective games where permissible. How are we doing? Oi! It looks pretty bad in Eastern China right now, so let's see. But I wanted to show you something else. We don't have sound. But basically, it's a series of games like this where you have a one-to-one interaction, just to give you a feel, basically, of how that game, how the game dynamics is. So that's not macro level; it's actually micro level. It's really on the one-to-one level. You play and you're interacting openly in an environment. You're learning about people, their problems in a real-world setting, and so on. And then, so it has a bit of a dialogue-based role-playing game feel. If you guys know Monkey Island or things like that, those really old games. Yeah, some people do. Good. And that's kind of similar, a bit more interactive. But then, of course, with events that are intermittent, right? So, police enforcement and then the suffering that's associated with this, the erroneous, friendly fire effects, and what the implication of this are, potential interrogations on the street and things like this. So you gather the idea. Then you get news in addition to it, photo evidence, quotes, and whatever else, and you kind of build your own narrative, own understanding, which you then face ultimately in this so-called boss fight, where you then just exchange argumentation because you're put into that very setting, right? So I mean, it's quite real, it's quite visual, and so on. But it's still made with the intent to be consumed by students, right? High school students. So it's quite an interesting angle to take. The idea was this thing cost 80,000 euros, one per game, roughly. And the idea was to sell that to schools, along with training material about the respective topics, Palestine, for example, so they could discuss it in a teaching setting and then actually play the game, and have discussion-based interaction with the students afterwards. So it was actually meant for school settings, even though it doesn't necessarily look like it. So quite interesting. The other one here is another one sensitizing you for social issues such as sweatshop shop labor in Bangladesh. Also similar. And they won, I forgot to mention that. They won quite significant awards for I think the Palestine one in particular, because of its very innovative approach to teaching. So, or experiencing / teaching in this setting. And here it's about you entering the rural Bangladesh and actually engaging into the reality of child labor, right? On the one hand, the obvious perspective, how could you? That was so horrible. On the other hand, well, it's a breadwinner of the family. So there's suddenly a bit of a juxtaposition of different positions and kind of a more refined perspective on what's relevant in those societies, right? So because we see it on a very comfortable perspective. The mechanics are absolutely the same, pretty much. You're interacting with this, you are collecting information, argumentation, and then have this whatever boss fight that would be in the end as an outcome. So it has a very similar mechanic. In fact, all those games, the corruption game as well, are modeled around the same kind of dynamic. I mentioned that one here. They do a lot more games, but I just want to sample those ones because they had quite some influence, and they're still. You can't play them actively because you do buy them, kind of a license, but you can review them here. It's quite nice. Screenshot here from the Palestine one. But there's also outcome. I mean, even though we didn't talk about research, I'm mostly showing you games, which is interesting, but sometimes the evidence is a bit lacking here. But in any case, for the Bangladeshi example, the main outcome is basically that students kind of soften down, right? So the idea is that the dogmatic students, so they had very strong positions, very strong predispositions, kind of got much more nuanced with respect to the understanding of the issues that are involved, right? And it's a complex issue, right? It's not just, how can you put a child to labor, but there's some more economic dependencies and expectations, social norms, and so on, that play into it. And of course, perhaps a lack of a regulatory enforcement and things like this. So, and the idea was basically they gave more nuanced perspective, something we want to teach as well, right? So something we need to teach people as well, that it's important to look at all sides and relativize it and recognize complexity when it's there, right? So don't try to find self-evident simple answers. So that's one example there. That's on the social issue side, is quite relevant. I give you two examples of less, significance. The other one here is called Enercities. It was also done in 2009. Shifts the perspective a bit on other issue awareness, energy. Right? So energy saving, big deal for us here anyway, but in general in Europe, it's a big deal. How do we do have a more sustainable ecology, and how do we minimize use of fossil fuels and so on, right? So I think mid-20s now we will outlaw fossil cars, right? So you can't buy new cars anymore, they have rely on fossil fuels and so on. But in earlier times, so it's now 10 years ago, 10, 11 years ago, there was an EC-funded approach to develop a game that also should stimulate awareness about what sustainability means, and in conjunction with energy consumption. Basically, you're starting off with the village and kind of have a SimCity style kind of approach, and can take different pathways, and it will basically, the game will indicate where you stand with respect to the ecological focus, the profit, the kind of earning, kind of the status you earned more generally, and that one I forgot. Anyway, so you're placed for different levels, and you eventually end up with a bigger city, and that's hopefully somewhat sustainable. I've looked for research in this area or on this game, and they had reported there was a white paper on this thing, but I haven't found any study that had been using it. It's a bit disappointing, given that it was such a large consortium that funded it actually. So one of the more unfortunate outcomes, but it's a noteworthy initiative that shifts the focus on a socially relevant issues, and is funded by a governmental body. Another one I want to show you. So that's on that side. Drifting off to awareness one again. From probably should have discussed in the other order tags, but from an awareness one, from a different perspective, it fits better to the child labor one. The idea of Food Force. Food Force was funded by the World Health Organization, so not by the European Commission, so it's quite big picture thing. The idea was it's a very arcade-oriented game, so a global game board, and so that you can play with, so it's single player fundamentally. The idea is you are facing concrete shortages in food, and you need to manage the ground operations for getting food there, or investigate and so on, right? So you have air surveillance, you can do airdrops, located dispatch, food runs, farming initiatives and so on. So there's a lot of interventions you can actually perform in that game, but the game is fundamentally a thing. I have found a video clip of this one again. That's not the official one. I think it's more or less a. No, it is actually supposedly the official one, but it gives you a feel of what this thing is about. So puts you into issues at that time. What was the issue at the time? Darfur, right? Was a pretty hot topic there. So various. So when you're basically running those operations, so finding people, navigating trucks to the target area and so on. So it's very hands-on, that one. So it's less, a bird's eye perspective and clicking and choosing, but actually realizing it. Right? So it makes more for a game experience, an arcade experience, right? The question is there, okay, how much learning is there really? How much enjoyment is there really, right? Do you have perhaps even positive associations with this in a sense that I want to play that again? But that's the idea by this game. So it's very hands-on arcade game. What was publicly funded by World Health Organization. The idea is that people get a feel of the complexity and the challenges associated with food distribution and so on. I'm not sure if it's still playable to some extent, but I shouldn't go into gameplays here, but since I'm tempted, I hope they don't block our channel here. Because we're streaming YouTube via YouTube, that's generally not a good idea. But it makes for an exciting experience. So, yeah, exactly. That's how you see it, right? So if you actually do a literal food run, there are things like that. So that was 2005. So quite worthwhile. Again, I didn't find any research particularly done on this, but it's still an example for a game that puts you in awareness space, and I think it's for a younger audience. That would not be the Bangladeshi one, for example, would be towards more mature students. I think this could be a potential considerably younger audience. There's another game called Food Force 2. Not sure who funded that one, but the idea is it's open source and it allows you to play collaboratively as well. So it's one of those games. Yeah, Food Force. Okay. So now I'm turning to more. This was more on the entertainment side, I suspect. Social issues, awareness more generally, strong funding bodies. Now I'm looking at some games that are more on the side of raising individuals' awareness, number one. Number two, being more set in an academic discipline. And one of those games is called Purpose. It's actually a bachelor thesis developed at the University of Economics in Vienna, I believe, in Austria, if I get it right. It was actually bachelor work. And the idea is there to investigate sexism, racism in a game, to figure out if you have biases. So it's really targeted at the player to realize their own biases and preferences. And it's quite a simple game. I haven't found a playable version of it, but I find it quite intriguing from an analytical standpoint. That you have 3 stages. You select the team initially, then you set up a camp. You need to gather resources, guard the camp. So set up basically your own fort, more or less, and then you're subjected to zombie attacks. Of course, what else? What else could the average university student be exposed to? It must be zombie attacks, of course. So that's the idea, right? And so basically that's how a game goes. You select your team, set a camp, face the zombie. So okay. And the thing about this game is it was meant as a research project. And guess what how that would work, the research project? What kind of result would it be seeking? What would it operate on, please? Yeah?
Did they not disclose that it was about sexism and racism, or did they just
I think they have not done the actual study. So That's the pity. But how would you attack it? What you think the means is by which they would detect biases?
Well, if I interpret correctly, maybe they would see like which characters maybe players chose to prioritize or maybe save or.
Yeah, precisely. That was the idea. Basically, you play the whole game, and the only thing that mattered was that bit. Just to figure out whom you picked or didn't pick and so on. And then draw conclusions a bit, and then provide the students or the respective individual with feedback that hopefully raises the awareness about biases. It's not about raising in a strong sense, about awareness of your own biases. We all have them anyway. So that's one of the objectives of this one game purpose. Unfortunately, I haven't seen much more of it, but sounds like an interesting approach. What is intriguing there, that's really so close to research, right? It was just here the games literally means to an end for research as opposed to for learning per se for the people, so it's kind of borderline useful there. Another one which is quite complementary, so that was one example. Another one I definitely need to showcase is this one, Child Lebensborn. Who knows about this game? Yep. Why do you know about this game?
Well, I know about it because of Richard, kind of.
Yeah. Share, please.
Yeah.
Share, talk.
He was our teacher in games.
Yeah.
He worked with Sarepta.
That's correct.
So the game is about children of like after the Second World War, there were a lot of German soldiers that had kids with Norwegian girls here in Norway, right? So there are kids that have like their fathers are German soldiers, and they were kind of like, what do you call it, like
Outcasts,
yeah.
probably. Yeah. So there was a bit of a basically exactly like this, right? So what do you do actually after war, right? It was not during war, it was after war. You know, you have been in a country for a considerable time, of course. There's always interaction with the local country. But what happens to the remainder, the offspring that, for example, comes about by this, right? So, and that was called Lebensborn because there was a foundation, I think, in Nazi Germany that kept track of those individuals as well. So they considered, proper Germans there at that time, and the idea was, sure, it's a horrible thing and what has been done, but here the idea is to shift the perspective on the child. Because what did those children go through, right? And should have been. Unfortunately, you don't have sound. It's a really touching. If you probably saw it before, right? The very touching trailer that they produced, and the game is basically played as you stepping in the role of a guardian, right? You're getting one of those children, right? Because they were distributed. Oftentimes, guess what? The men were gone. Or the fathers at least in any case, and the women may not have wanted it, so they were richly distributed, but now this child has to grow up generally known that it is what was one of those children, right? So, and then of course being subjective to this, what we now consider perhaps bullying as an issue, that was a very real thing there. And the idea is that you can take the footsteps there basically and think about from your perspective about this sensitive topic to some extent, mutually sensitive, because it's a very local topic here, but of course it's also a very topic that requires perspective taking and empathy to some extent. And that's a really beautiful thing. And the best thing about it, what is the best thing about this game? Those are the archives where they kept track of the children records, for example. And then little things were helpful things, yep.
Well, I guess it gives you a lot of perspective of issues they have, but it also relates to like today as well. Yeah. People that are outcasts.
Exactly, right? But this is not the best thing. The best thing is actually they won the BAFTA for this. So who knows what BAFTA is? Yeah, don't ask me to spell it out. British Academy for Television and Film Awards or something like this. They also categorize games. They won the 2019 BAFTA on this thing. So that's big. That's like the Oscar in the game world, right? So from Hamar, right here, Hamar. Come on, guys. Yeah, exactly. You from Hamar?
Hamar area.
Okay, well done. Pick the right spot to be. So, so this is really, really important to mention because this is really close to home here. It's very contemporary, super impactful. It was so impactful it has actually been banned in various countries because of the sensitivity of the issue. Including, I think, Germany for some period because they didn't know how to gauge it. In Russia, for sure. in some other countries, but I think they lifted it again. Richard told about some interesting stories there. Yeah, and one of the lecturers who teach on the third-year game programming course, he was co-developing this game here. So it's actually quite nice experience. But here's I think the owner, Saripta Games, part of Hamaka Game Collective, receiving the BAFTA for the Data Spill Oscar, you know. Yeah.